I love difficult video games. From staples in video game difficulty like the Dark Souls series to lesser-known titles like Everhood, from turn-based tactical combat in XCOM 2 to speed-of-light gameplay like Ultrakill, I love playing games that require dedicated time, effort, and skill to play. I mean games like Doom Eternal or Sekiro, but dependent on a player's skill and experience, could include games like Risk of Rain 2 or even Fall Guys. It's very subjective. But an important question that many ask is, are difficult video games a good thing? Questioning the purpose of video games themselves. Some argue that video games are meant to be relaxing and enjoyable, while others argue that difficulty is what makes these games fun. I believe that difficult video games are important, valuable, and essential to the video game industry, but not all difficulty is created equal. What makes a game like Cat Mario difficult is completely different than what makes a game like GTFO difficult, one being based off of gimmicks and tricks, while the other is based off of teamwork and cooperation. The big question I want to examine is this: what makes video games difficult and what makes good difficulty? I believe that the best video game difficulty is primarily a mix of physical and mental difficulty with only a small amount of artificial difficulty. To explain my answer, I'll be covering the history of difficult video games, researching why people play difficult video games in the first place, examining different groups of video game difficulty, and finally debating what makes good difficulty. For a brief history lesson on why difficult video games exist in the first place, we have to look all the way back to the beginning of video games. Starting in the mid-1970s, video games became a popular hit with the release of arcade cabinets, with Pong estimated to be generating around $40 a day in revenue upon release. That's around $300 a day today. So these games had an economic incentive to be hard since players had to pay for each play. Developers were encouraged to make their games hard so that players would have to try and try again before succeeding, thus making the developers a profit. Similarly, during the release of home consoles like the Atari and the NES, developers were constrained by the strict file size limitations of the consoles, meaning that they could fit less game into each of the cartridges. To compensate for that lack of content, developers would intentionally increase the difficulty of their games to pad out the playtime with a very long try-fail-succeed cycle. This also spawned the term Nintendo Hard games, referencing notoriously difficult NES games like Mega Man and Ghosts and Goblins. As time passed, developers had less incentive to create difficult games, but players remained with a desire for challenge. But why is that so? What draws players to play games that are intentionally challenging to their audience? First, I searched to answer that question from a psychological perspective. I thought maybe there's something that instinctively draws us towards challenge, and I was nearly right. Humans, for the most part, are goal-oriented beings, says Dr. Natalie Coyle, a mental health researcher. In one of her articles covering difficult video games, she talks about how despite humans being goal-oriented beings, life is often structured with long periods of work before receiving rewards, like school, college, or careers. She says this is where difficult video games such as Dark Souls and Cuphead brighten up people's lives. At their core, these games are a sequence of goals and rewards. By giving players goals to complete and challenges to overcome, games help give bursts of motivation between longer stretches of life. Difficult video games do this even more so than average games by having bigger goals to complete and harder challenges to overcome. Taken from New York Film Academy's article on hard games, there's something captivating about playing a seemingly unbeatable game where the odds are against you. It's why after defeating a boss in Dark Souls or completing a stage in Mega Man, you feel like your diligence and tenacity paid off. Similarly, the computer scientist Paul Schrader, who believes in the concept of constraint satisfaction, said, "Our brains are designed to be very complex, constraint satisfaction machines, where goal-seeking and having a goal means defining a constraint on an outcome." All this data and research pointed towards the desire for difficult video games stemming from people's goal-seeking tendencies, but I wanted to confirm my suspicions from an actual enjoyer of difficult video games. And thus, I decided to have a chat with somebody who has dominated the pinnacle of difficulty in one of the hardest games of recent years, and his name is Let Me Solo Her. For some context, Elden Ring is the newest game in the Dark Souls series of games, renowned for their extreme punishing difficulty. In Elden Ring, however, there is one boss fight against a warrior named Malenia, and fighting her requires precise timing, immaculate dodging, and a tactical mindset for the lengthy fight. Her fight is ultra challenging but a great example of well-made difficulty. Now, Let Me Solo Her became virally famous as he could not only defeat Malenia consistently, but he would frequently help other players defeat her, even getting recognition from the publishers of Elden Ring for doing so. Currently, he sits at around 7,000 victories against her, and I got the pleasure of interviewing him. When I got on a call with him, after introducing ourselves, I started off strong by asking this:
Do you enjoy difficult video games? And if so, what kind of attracts you to playing different difficult video games?
Um, to be honest, I actually would say that I don't enjoy difficult video games.
I was initially shocked, but next he talked about how he believed that the Souls series gets significantly easier as you play them and that he wouldn't call them difficult video games.
So every Souls game that I played, whenever it clicks, then I would stop calling it a difficult game or call it an unfair game. But um, what attracted me to playing this sort of Soulsborne game genre is that click, basically.
Hearing that confirmed what I had heard from other sources I had looked at, and as he continued throughout the interview, it made more and more sense. When I asked about Malenia, he mentioned how he only beat her after 240 attempts with the help of other players, but the desire to really beat her made him come back over and over again. Now that we finally understand why developers make difficult video games and why players still play them, we can finally examine what makes video games difficult. Well, there's a lot of different video games that express difficulties in a lot of different ways, and I've tried to sort most types of difficulty into 3 different groups. For the main groups of difficulty, most difficulty can be sorted into physical, mental, or artificial difficulty. Physical difficulty can be defined as mastery of input-output peripherals, encompassing challenges that require quick reaction time and precise inputs to overcome. Mental difficulty covers all the challenge that resides in a player's head, requiring planning ahead and critical analysis to overcome. And finally, artificial difficulty is the mixed bag, the modification of pre-existing gameplay that increases its difficulty, including stat changers, number modifications, and additional rules and limitations. Starting off with physical difficulty, it can be split up into 2 categories, mechanical challenges and reaction challenges. Mechanical challenge is literally the difficulty of making timely, appropriate inputs into the game. An ultra kill is the difficulty made up by precisely aiming and shooting, maneuvering around the stage at rapid speeds, and swapping weapons every second. It takes a physical toll of pressing this many buttons per second, and it creates a high learning curve for the player and their hands. Reaction challenges, on the other hand, come from the player's eyes, being the quick analysis of a game's screen and quickly responding to stimuli on screen. In this Everhood footage, you can see the player rapidly responding to everything thrown at them, using visual cues and extremely precise timing to decide what to do next. For mental difficulty, it's often expressed through multitasking challenges or logical puzzle challenges. Multitasking challenges can be best seen in games like XCOM 2, where the player has to constantly think about and manage multiple threats and challenges at once. In XCOM 2, each soldier in a team that the player commands can be a menace when properly positioned, but will die instantly if a group of enemies is forgotten about. For logical puzzle challenges, the player is given a set environment, set rules, and is let loose to use their critical reasoning to decide what actions to take to complete a task or find an answer. In Into the Breach, it's presented by giving the player the task of defending buildings with a very limited amount of moves, and each action the player takes requires planning ahead to result in the best outcome. And finally, there's artificial difficulty. By artificial difficulty, I mean modifications to a game that can increase the challenge of completing a task. This can include stat-changing challenges in a game, like Near Replicant's hard mode, that simply increases enemy health and damage, resulting in a hard mode filled with padded playtime. Artificial difficulty can mean gimmick challenges like in Cat Mario, where there's no skill involved in predicting what comes next, just blind trolls and pixel-perfect platforming you can't know ahead of time. Artificial difficulty is typically some sort of challenge designed to limit or spite the player, and these are only some examples of what it could look like. There are many ways artificial difficulty can be implemented. They usually don't make good challenges on their own, but when used in moderation and combined with other types of difficulty, they can be. Now, after finally examining why people play difficult video games and how video games implement difficulty, we can finally answer the question of what makes good difficulty in video games. Near the end of my interview with Let Me Solo Her, I asked him what he thought good difficulty in video games was, and this is how he responded.
There's also a lot of tools at hand, and it's up to you, the player, to explore or make use of it however you see fit to make the games difficult for you or easier for you.
Good difficulty should challenge a player, but also give them the tools and opportunities to overcome it. It should let the player make a challenge easier or harder depending on their perseverance and mastery of a game. And I believe that the best difficulty is kind of like preparing a meal. If you can imagine the physical and mental difficulty as the meat and vegetables of the meal, and artificial difficulty as the spice. A substantial blend of physical and mental difficulty can create a perfect main course with just enough artificial difficulty to perfect a result.